back, everyone. Our next speaker, Barbara Cosens, is a professor of law at the University of Idaho College of Law, where she teaches water law, water policy, and law and science. Professor Cosens is also a member of the Universities Consortium on Columbia River Governance.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming back from the tea for this. Well, I'd like to begin simply by saying thank you so much to our gracious hosts here at National Law University. This has been an absolutely wonderful event, a wonderful stay, and thank you to my alma mater, Lewis and Clark, for organizing this and inviting me. As Alexis said, I am, in addition to teaching at the University of Idaho, a member, along with Aaron, of the Universities Consortium on Columbia River Governance, which are representatives of 6 universities in the Pacific Northwest, working from the academic perspective on the treaty review process that's currently taking place between Canada and the United States. We hold forums for cross-border dialogues. We try to connect both our research and our students to this major public policy process that's occurring within the basin. But I'm not really going to talk about that today. What I'm going to talk about today is the role of Indigenous communities in a major transboundary negotiation, using the Columbia River Basin and what they're doing there to talk about it. And one thing that I think we can draw from looking at the Columbia River Basin is there are some lessons on how to raise the voice of either Indigenous communities or local communities of any nature in these major water processes. And I think it touches on 2 of the themes that kind of ran through the discussions yesterday. And one was that establishing the right is really only the first step, and we can't stop there. There's a huge gap between, for example, saying someone has a right to water and actually satisfying thirst. And then secondly, that giving a voice to local communities in decision making is not something that can happen from the top down. We can't come in and impose some process that looks nothing like the traditional roles that people played in water and expect that to work. And so those are kind of the 2 lessons that I'm going to do. I think we figured this out, and maybe we didn't. Thank you. But thanks, Aaron. And fittingly, this is Aaron's slide. So that's perfect timing. So this shows from Aaron's database the water basins in North America. And so I'm taking you back to the same location that Jan talked about in the beginning this morning, and that's the Columbia Basin, which is in the Pacific Northwest, crossing the boundary between Canada and the United States. And the mountainous part, the basin rises in the Rocky Mountains, which are on the eastern part, and then its outlet is to the Pacific Ocean. And it's the 4th largest river basin in the United States, but it is the largest producer of hydroelectricity within North America. So it's extremely important for that. It's also an area of considerable beauty. So if you start in the top left and go clockwise around this, in the top left you see some of the mountainous headwaters within Canada, comes down through a very scenic gorge where it forms the boundary between Oregon and Washington, the 2 states. And then you see it in the bottom passing the city of Portland, which is where Lewis and Clark Law School is located, and then finally its outlet to the Pacific Ocean at the estuary. And the fact that it arises in high mountains makes it very similar to the Ganja River. So we have very large amounts of what would be referred to as natural storage, as snowpack, and then we have very high potential for flooding during spring runoff. And so these photos come from the last major flood that occurred within the basin in 1948. It flooded communities in both Canada and the United States. This particular community, Vanport, Oregon, was right next to Portland, and it was completely wiped out. Fortunately, there was enough warning that there was very little loss of life in that. But at that time, most of the dams on the river were what are called run-of-the-river, and you heard MC Mehta use that term yesterday, and he was talking about on the Ganja where you simply divert water through tunnels to produce hydroelectricity and back into the river. The way it's done on the Columbia River is there's actually a dam, but all the dam serves is to channel the water through the turbines for the production of hydropower. They don't actually create any storage behind the dam, and so there wasn't really a way at that time to prevent the floods, and the major locations where good storage capacity could be created through putting in dams were all located in Canada. And that's really, even though studies were underway at the time, that's really what catalyzed negotiation between the United States and Canada and the development of the Columbia River Treaty. And so this slide just summarizes some of the major provisions of the treaty. It entered into force on September 16th, 1964. The United States, 3 dams were built in Canada, and the United States paid Canada for 60 years of assured flood control from those dams. That will expire September 16th, 2024. What the studies did leading up to it were looked for ways that the two countries could have mutual benefit from development of the river, and they identified only 2 at that time. So that was the flood control and joint production of hydroelectricity. And I'm going to go to the next slide to show that. So what this slide shows is the drop of the river. It actually drops as much as 2 kilometers from the headwaters down to the ocean. And so with all of the dams on both the tributaries and the main stem, if you release water from a dam in the upper part of the basin, it's going to produce hydroelectric power in every single dam that it goes through downstream. And so what the treaty did was allowed that to happen, allowed for coordination for the timing of release to maximize the production of hydropower, and then 50% of what is produced at each of the dams within the United States from release of water in Canada is called the Canadian Entitlement. That is power that belongs to Canada. Currently, for the existing life of the treaty, Canada has not needed that power, and they sell it back to the United States, and particularly selling it in the winter to the southwestern United States, the big cities in Southern California and Arizona, for air conditioning, makes it be a very high dollar value. Currently, the Canadian Entitlement, depending on the cost of energy, the market on any given time is worth between $90 and $350 million per year. So very high value for Canada out of that. Next slide. But there's another story having to do with this basin, and you heard some of it from Jan this morning. And that's what I'm going to get to is the story of the indigenous people in the basin, people that existed there before European contact with North America. But in the Columbia Basin, any story of indigenous people begins with the iconic species of salmon that Jan talked about earlier. And as she said, they're anadromous fish, so they have a very amazing life cycle. They spend their adult life in the ocean, they migrate and somehow find their way back to, in most cases, the stream on which they were spawned to lay their eggs and then die, and the juveniles spend some time as residents in freshwater and then move back to the ocean and repeat that life cycle. It's an amazing life cycle, and the fossil record shows that salmon have been in this basin for 20 million years, over 20 million years. And these particular fish that you see in these are Snake River sockeye and Redfish Lake. Snake River is one of the major tributaries to the Columbia. They have gone up freshwater streams, up the Columbia River and the Snake River, 1,500 kilometers to reach this lake. And in doing that, they've risen. So they've been swimming upstream, going up 2 kilometers to get there. The other thing about the Columbia River Basin is it's located on the Pacific Rim, which is an area that's very geologically active. So we have volcanoes, we have earthquakes, we have landslides. And so when you think of a 20 million year history of this species, they have developed a very robust evolutionary strategy to survive in that active geologic setting. And so there are many different populations that run up the river at different times. That increases the chance of survival of the species. And they're able to populate different or spawn in different tributaries, which increases their survival rate. And what that has created then is a very diverse species with numerous runs within this basin. So evidence indicates then that human contact with the region was as much as 10,000 years ago. And salmon played a very big role in the history of indigenous people from what we refer to as time immemorial. It's impossible to overstate the role of salmon to indigenous communities within the Columbia River Basin. It's not only was the primary source of protein, but the fishing sites were locations where multiple tribes gathered and had major festivals. They were the source of intertribal marriage, of trade among tribes, of festivals and the teaching of traditions to be passed on to children for traditional practices. And there's no better way to show the centrality than to talk about how salmon are a part of the creation story of many of the Columbia River tribes. And at least the tribal people that I've had the privilege to get to know in the West have a great sense of humor in the way they tell these stories. So one way it's been told to me is that when the Creator was getting ready to bring people forth, they kind of thought this was kind of an interesting new thing that they were going to bring forth into creation, but they were really kind of stupid and helpless, and so really to survive they would need the help of all creation in order to make it in this world. So the Creator called a grand council of all creation and asked them to give a gift to help people survive. The very first to come forward was salmon. And salmon offered their body for food to help the people survive. The second to come forward was water, to offer habitat for the salmon to live in. That is how central salmon are to the people of the Pacific Northwest. So salmon, as they migrate upstream, the Columbia River rises in a series of steps with these flat basalt flows, and so you can sort of see the steps here, and the salmon have to make their way all the way up those in order to go the 2 kilometers up to Redfish Lake. And what the indigenous people did was it takes a little bit of time to get up through these falls, usually several tries to do it, and so the salmon back up at each of the steps along the way, and so those became the gathering sites for fishing during the timing of the runs in these places for the festivals. And so it was really a very robust sort of social ecological interaction where the indigenous people were using the natural features of the stream to maximize their harvest. Oral history also indicates that they had their own traditions with respect to priority for fishing, what practices were necessary, ceremonies to allow the first fish to continue past the fishing grounds. So various traditions that ensured that salmon would always be there. They also had traditional practices of sharing the catch with the elderly and with the infirm to assure that they had food as well. Well, you can tell by the clothing in this picture that this is after European contact. So European contact had occurred about 150 years before this picture was taken, and that dramatically changed the relationship between humans and salmon within the basin. What this graph shows is the decline in the numbers of just one of the populations, the Snake River Chinook, but that's paralleled throughout the populations of salmon. And what you see is on the left of the slide in the late 1800s is when European contact in this area was in the early 1800s for the really beginning of major European contact. But by the late 1800s, the canneries had come in. Europeans had introduced canneries and sort of industrial scale fishing. They used these big fish wheels that would scoop the salmon out. And so that first big drop in the population you see as the introduction of this industrial scale harvest, and then they prop it up with hatcheries, as Jan mentioned earlier, putting hatcheries into the basin. The next big decline that you see starting in the 1930s was when we started building dams on the river, and I find I have to drink a ton of water here. And that decline, because of the dams, continued until these populations were listed under the United States Endangered Species Act. And what this shows is a list of the listing of the populations, but for my purposes, what I want you to see are the red lines on the main stem of the Columbia and each of the tributaries. Those represent dams where there is no fish passage, so no ability for the fish to get up to their natal streams to spawn. And so about almost 40% of the basin is blocked from spawning that was formerly open to it. So that's one of the things that's caused the decline. The other thing is dams change the hydrograph, particularly when you start putting in storage facilities. And so what you see is the major peak spring runoff that we used to experience, we no longer experience. For people, that has protected us from floods, but that has also caused a problem for salmon because that's what would flush the juvenile salmon out to sea. And so with that huge flow, they needed to expend very little energy and have very little residence time in the system to be exposed to prey. And so it's really these changes, the blockage and the change in the hydrograph, in addition to all of the habitat issues that Jan mentioned, that has caused that major decline. At the same time, we've seen a huge decline in both the numbers of indigenous people within the basin and their power. So in 1803, when the Lewis and Clark expedition, which the school is named after, came through this area, the entire basin would have been the territory of Native Americans. In the United States, we call that Indian country, and I realize that wouldn't be the appropriate term to use here, having confused the word. So it was all the home of Native Americans and all their territory, and what you see happened in very much the same period of time as the decimation of the salmon runs. Really, a generation of time passed in the late 1800s in which this just looks at 4 of the reservations were diminished from the lighter areas shown here to the darker areas. So a huge loss in territory. If any of you have read the book by Jared Diamond, it really was about guns, germs, and steel. So the railroads came through, warfare with the European people that were colonizing the area, and germs, malaria, and smallpox within this area really decimated the populations. The next slide shows Where the reservations are within the basin now, there are 15 reservations within the U.S. portion of the basin. There are 17 what are referred to in Canada. These are basically the same tribes with kinship south of the border, but in Canada referred to as First Nations. 17 First Nations claim land or water resources within the basin in Canada. After 50 years of hydropower production and flood control under the Columbia River Treaty, that treaty is under review. And as you might imagine, in 1964, there had been no Indigenous voice in the making of the treaty that would govern their former homelands. What is happening now, something very different is happening in the review of the treaty. So, as I said earlier, major flood control provisions expire in 2024. The treaty has a provision that allows either country to unilaterally withdraw from the treaty as early as that date of flood control expiration, but they have to give 10 years notice. So September 16, 2024 is the date on which, the first date on which they could give notice if they want to withdraw when the flood control provisions expire. Now, we talked yesterday about the need for data to make these kinds of decisions. Well, a very robust process of collecting, synthesizing really existing information and modeling what might happen under different alternatives if we look at maybe negotiating a new treaty or simply letting this one continue without flood control or terminating it. And the processes on both the U.S. and the Canadian side have really been very different in how they've involved Indigenous people. On the U.S. side, they have what's called the Sovereign Review Team. The 15 tribes have 5 representatives on that team. The 4 states within the basin each have 1 representative. And they are integral to developing alternatives to be looked at in terms of their impact on the basin. In British Columbia, the provincial review process is also going through a very robust consultation process with the tribes and a public involvement process. These are pictures taken at one of the gatherings, the cross-border dialogues that we had last October with the consortium, in which the 15 tribes in the U.S. Continued their dialogue to develop their positions on the Columbia River Treaty. But what was very interesting about this was an opportunity for the tribes on the U.S. side of the border to come together with the First Nations from the Canadian side. And it really has marked the first time that the Indigenous people within this basin have really played a major role in developing alternatives to be viewed for international policy. So what's changed? I think the lessons, if we're going to take lessons from this, we have to ask ourselves, what changed? What changed between 1964 and now that has allowed these people to have a very significant seat at the table? One thing that you can point to is just what's happening generally. Since 1964, there's been certainly a dramatic rise in environmental values. And the recognition, as Jan talked about earlier, of ecosystem services to human survival. And so in some ways you can simply say that the values of the dominant society have come into line with the values of Indigenous people, and therefore they're gaining greater acceptance. We can also note that since 1964, there's a greater expectation of public involvement in governmental decision making. And so you no longer can ignore the voice of a major interest in making a governmental decision. But if that was all, if those 2 things were all, then tribal communities would simply be one more interest within the basin, similar to environmental interest, to have a voice in the process. And yet what we're seeing is that they're having a voice as sovereigns within the nation. So that to look at what's caused that, you really have to begin, the first step is looking at how their rights, the recognition of their rights, both internationally and domestically, have changed in that time period. So you can begin, you can point to, of course, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and one of the main things is recognizing the right to self-determination, particularly with respect to their land and to their resources. But there have been even more profound changes within the United States and Canada in their domestic law. And so to describe that, I have to go back to the treaties that were negotiated in the 1800s between the United States and some of these tribes. And this language comes out of Article 3 of the treaty that was negotiated with a number of the tribes. And what it basically says is that as your land is reduced to a smaller reservation, you have the exclusive right for fishing and control of fishing within your territory. But not only that, you have these major fishing sites on tributaries, on the Columbia River. You continue to have the right to fish at those, but you hold it in common with the citizens. Okay, so that's been on paper since 1955. And in the 1970s, as the voices, as the civil rights movement was going on, American Indian movement was something that happened in the wake of that in the United States, lawsuits started to be filed to interpret this. And in particular, this decision, called the Bolt decision, which comes out of a federal district court named after the judge who articulated the decision, was that this language means at the usual and accustomed locations, tribes have a right to 50% of the harvest. That is profound. And what that has led to is really step 2. So we have recognition of the right. The tribes then had to develop the capacity to not only make sure that right was protected, but to allocate it among themselves. Here's 4 tribes with 50% of the harvest. How are we going to share that? Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission is the organization they formed, and it's a very sophisticated agency that uses science and policy to protect these rights. They've been very instrumental in the endangered species listings, the litigation concerning that, and they receive a lot of money then from hydropower development as mitigation for the harm that's been caused to the salmon. One of the important things to see when a tribe is able to develop their own capacity, they have held fast to the fact that traditional ecological knowledge will inform the science and policy developed by their agency. And that has made a profound difference. The 15 tribes have come together in this process with what they call the Common Views document. And as you can imagine, tribes that are competing over salmon have not always spoken with one voice. And this really represents probably one of the first times they've spoken with one voice. And what they are saying is there has to be an indigenous sovereign voice in management of this river. There need to be equitable benefits to the tribes, and the traditional ecological knowledge must inform management within the river. It is really what we're witnessing, what Erin and I have been witnessing in the process, is it's really the first time that ecological function is now seriously being considered in the review process as becoming a third prong of the treaty. So hydropower, flood control, and ecosystem function. Now, in contrast, in Canada, we have step 1, the recognition of the right. The 1982 patriation of the Constitution recognized the rights of Aboriginal people and the need for consultation with respect to their land and resources. But that has only begun to be put into implementation. Tribes within the First Nations within the Columbia River have not yet seen the realization of that. There are a number of attorneys providing pro bono service to help them in this process. At my university, our students are required to do pro bono service, so I have students that are working for those attorneys, providing research. But what's really changed things for First Nations is the tribes with substantial capacity in the United States are now meeting with them and helping them to develop their own positions and capacity. So getting to the end of my time, I conclude with what are the lessons that we can draw from this? And what I think that the first step certainly is the recognition of the right, but it can't stop there. Self-determination is the freedom of people to be able to choose their own path. And the only way they can do that is through the building of local capacity that has to come from the bottom up. And the local capacity is the possession themselves of their own skills and knowledge and ability to assert those rights, manage their resources, develop their own priorities. What I think we're seeing, and I hope I'm right, that we're seeing in the Columbia Basin is a paradigm shift. It really is a difference in the role of Indigenous communities within at least this transboundary negotiation that I think we can take lessons from for use elsewhere. One of the things that the tribes have brought to the table in the Columbia River is they're very concerned with ecological function, but they're also, they have the same wants we all want for our children. They want economic development. And so the balance they've brought to the table between economic development and ecological function, in my observation, has really defined what many of us are struggling to find, the meaning of sustainable development. They've really brought the best view of that. And I think all of those of us who come from the Columbia River Basin are going to benefit from that voice going forward. So with that, I'll conclude and be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.